Hey everyone, I'm here with founder of the New Warehouse podcast, Kevin Lawton. Kevin, thanks for coming on the program.
Alex, thanks for having me on. Very happy to be on today.
Yeah, for sure. Now, your typical role is on the other side of this microphone, where you're the one
Yeah.
asking the questions and walking through. And today, we're going to antagonize you and see what you can bring to us.
Definitely. We turn the microphone around a little bit, we could say.
That's right. That's right. Hey, so
Sure.
why don't we just start there? Is like, who is Kevin Lawton? What's your story? How did you get into this whole podcasting thing, even supply chain for that matter? I'd love to hear some of that journey along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't intend to get into supply chain, and I also didn't intend to get into podcasting either. So I think it's a little bit interesting twist that things took there. I would say when I was young, my dream job was to be a chef. That's actually what I wanted to do. Kind of always knew that I wanted to have my own business in some way and wanted to be an entrepreneur. My mother has had a consulting her own business for about 30 some years now. So maybe some of the inspiration for that comes from that. But always kind of, had many different ideas and, being in one place, I guess you could say, or focusing on like one thing at a time is like challenging to do, like, just very many different interests. So I ended up going to school for entrepreneurial studies was my major, and then actually minored in event planning and arts administration. So really like nothing to do with what I'm doing now, kind of. So
Of course, you're podcasting on supply chain. Of course, that's where that goes.
yeah. So you see the tie-in there, right? I mean, it's so clear. Um, so then graduated college. I ended up staying because I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and got my graduate degree as well. Got my MBA at Rider University here in New Jersey, and got my real estate license. Doing real estate a little bit for a while, and I think that I was talking about this with somebody the other day, and I think I got kind of like stuck in this headspace because when I went to college, like when I was just graduating high school, like that's when like Facebook just came out, and like you actually had to have a .edu email to get on Facebook, and so it was kind of this explosion of like this almost startup culture, I guess, in a sense, like with these big ideas, these big tech companies and things like that. And I think because of that, I got stuck in the mindset that I needed to have like some giant idea to be an entrepreneur, right? And start a company. And I just felt like, oh, I didn't have this giant idea. So I didn't know like what to start. And so I ended up, needing money, obviously, right? So I got a job as a temp, as an inventory control specialist, for a book publishing company, Simon and Schuster, and that's kind of like where the warehouse thing started, honestly. So I started to do that. It was interesting. It was a lot of like analysis between WMS systems and the ordering system, troubleshooting, root causing, why we had inventory discrepancies between the two systems, or why counts were off in the warehouse, and working with cycle counters and things like that. And I was rather good at it, I will say. And so they offered me a full-time job pretty quickly, and really just kind of grew from there. Like, my interest in it was slow at first, I will say, despite like, being good at it and being able to like significantly reduce variances that they had and things of that nature. And, I kind of had in the back of my head, like, oh, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do something else, right, for a while. And then at a point, I kind of realized like, this is like not a bad career. And I think that, I kind of looked around too, and I'm like, well, warehouses are not really going anywhere, right? So there's like longevity there, there's definitely things going on. And I started to learn a little bit more about the industry, but then I decided like, okay, I'm going to embrace this. And when I went to embrace it, I was looking for something that would keep my interest to learn from, like a podcast or like a blog or something like that. And I had kind of grown up on blogs in a sense, big time sneaker collector when I was in high
Oh, okay.
school and college, and still now, like, interested, but definitely not like hardcore like I was then. Like, I was, my first job in high school, I was working at Wawa, and pretty much the whole paycheck would go to sneakers basically. And, and like sneakers and gas money basically. And so yeah, so I would get all the information from blogs. So that was kind of like my natural inclination, like how do I learn from these blogs? And then I realized that there was nothing out there like that at the time. And this was probably like 2017, really, when I started to look for these kind of resources and figure that out. And along the way, I mentioned that, I have a hard time just doing like one thing at a time. So I had been doing real estate on the side too, as well. And that kind of led to me doing some freelance ghostwriting for the real estate industry and doing some blogging for that. And then actually, prior to the podcast, I actually did a real estate radio show at my alma mater for a little while. So that kind of gave me initial experience on the microphone, you could say. So I kind of, I guess, took all those experiences and was like, oh, well, maybe I could start a blog about the warehouse industry. And so I started out to try and do that. And at the same time, I was working for a company where we were going from like picking on paper, very old warehouse, like very outdated in process and technology, and moving to a new warehouse, coincidentally there, new warehouse, right? And putting in like a Dematic multi-shuttle system, putting in voice picking, setups, conveyor, all this stuff, like basically going, like 20, 30 years into the future in, 6 to 8 months, right? And so long hours, really focused there. And I was like, man, I don't have time to sit down and write and edit and then figure out how to even get this out into the world. So yeah, so it was an idea that I had been tossing around with my boss at the time as well, who we had worked together at like 3 different companies throughout my career. He just kept hiring me and bringing me with him. And he's really, I would say he's really the one that like really pulled me into the warehouse. Cause at one point, I had like 2 opportunities in front of me, and one was with him to continue on like a kind of a warehousing inventory control path. And then the other was actually to go like into the transportation side of things. And I chose to go the warehouse path. And that's kind of like, I would say maybe solidified it a little bit. But he was actually like, oh, I hear like podcasts are becoming a thing. And this is like 2018 probably. And I'm like, okay. Like I've never even listened to a podcast before. But that sounds a little easier maybe than writing, like sit down, talk, could be a little more raw than edit it. And that's kind of really how the idea for the podcast came about. And yeah, it was kind of like just, for me, it was really like just a way to learn more about the industry initially. And then now, like, 5 years later, it's become way more than I ever thought that it would be at all.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. There's so many there's a couple threads I want to pull on, but one where
Sure.
you just ended with that you started this thing really
Mhm.
primarily because you were looking to learn. You were looking to get this
Yeah.
information, to get this in that format, and you couldn't really find it. And so you just started this podcast, started interviewing folks. And now, I mean, for folks who aren't in this industry, or listeners that don't understand the supply chain industry, well, I mean, understand it, but aren't in it.
Hmm.
Kevin, what you built with the new warehouse is something where I think if I'm a new supply chain professional, I am going to pull up your podcast and I am going to listen to it to
Yeah.
understand what's going on in supply chain. And so you've truly delivered on the young man a few years ago who was trying to figure out more about supply chain. You've given that. So that's that's entrepreneurialism 101 right there, man.
Hmm.
Very cool. I love that. I know a lot of our folks in the company listen to your podcast. I listen to it. It's really great. The other piece though, what I love about what you're saying, you're right. I mean, certainly I don't know about now as folks are coming up through school or they're watching entrepreneurs, maybe they think they have to be a genius like Elon Musk or whatever, but you're right. Around that time frame, it felt like you had to have this this really amazing new idea, something that'll wow everybody. And the reality is, what you've done here has become a great idea, big idea, but it wasn't necessarily a big idea in the beginning. And that's some of the magic of that. And I love that was kind of your path. Mine
Yeah.
too. I remember feeling that I've got to come up with
Mhm.
something brilliant. I got to come up with something brilliant. And
Yeah.
maybe you don't. You just got to be brilliant at whatever you come up with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the thing that I've realized, and like I've noticed on X, like Twitter, right? Like there's like kind of this almost like resurgence of people, and like younger people too, like embracing like service-based businesses, right? Like,
Yeah.
whether it's like power washing or
Yeah.
dumpster rentals or lawn services and things like that. And I feel like, we did kind of like the entrepreneurial idea and the startup glitz and glamour with all this Silicon Valley and the startup things going on, like kind of lost a little bit of that. And I think, over time, like I did realize like, oh, like you don't need to have like this like earth changing, world changing idea. Like, you can be an entrepreneur, be very successful, and, have a great business, create a great company, by, an idea that's not necessarily new, or, by something that's not like this huge idea, but can still have an impact. And I think I've learned that certainly by, turning this podcast into a business over time. I mean, when I started it, I certainly wasn't thinking about it as a business. I really started, like you said, to, learn myself. I would think it was like two main reasons like why I started. Was one, because I wanted to learn, and I felt like, this was a way that I could learn from people, without just being like some random guy that's like asking you if I can talk to you for, half hour. And then the second was like just to get connected in the industry, because I felt like, I think there was a point I realized that, okay, if I am like a warehouse manager, for example, at this company, and I'm a warehouse manager at this company for the next 5 years, whatever the case may be, the exposure that I'm going to get to what's going on in the industry and other people within the industry too is probably going to be limited to like that company's ecosphere, unless I really diligently go out there and do a lot of research. And I kind of thought about that after a while, and I was like, like that's kind of the position that I took as, being what I was, right? And, then like through the podcast, like trying to talk to that person and give that person awareness and give that education as well. So that's really, kind of the drive, and has been like the underlying mission, I think, since I started it.
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, I'm always challenged. You've heard the advice. I've heard, everybody's heard it, like follow your passions, follow your heart. And
Yeah.
that's not always great advice. To your point, I mean, like sometimes you got to pay gas money, you got to find shoe money, you got to do these things. So you do things,
Yeah.
but it is interesting when the intersection of your passion, your interests, then come up with an opportunity in the market, which is what happened for you with the New Warehouse podcast. Your interests were intersecting in a perfect moment where there was a need in the market, but nothing to fill it, and you filled that in a cool way. And that's like the primo entrepreneurship right there, no matter whether it's on a grandiose scale or across an entire industry, or even in, I've learned a lot of entrepreneurial lessons from people right here in my small West Virginia town that didn't change the world outside of this community, but maybe they did in. And it's cool. The other thing I want to point out too is the gentleman you talked about who kind of pulled you into this industry and held you here potentially. We've been talking about a lot internally here about champions, and that's one of our tenets around our environment on championship. And it's just always great. Almost every story I ever ask anybody to tell me about their path, there's always somebody or somebodies along the way who have lifted them up or pulled them in a direction. And sometimes not always great, right? We get detractors too, but there's always champions along the way. And I love it when someone's telling their story and I hear it, I see it, like there's a champion. And I'm sure there's more on your story, but that's cool. Like somebody found the value in you and said, come with me as I go to these places and we do cool things together. And that's fun in and of itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, through having him like have pulled me along with him and give me these opportunities, like in a short amount of time being in the warehousing industry, I was able to just get a ton of experience, because we somehow we found ourselves like kept going to companies that wanted to, or that were in the process of like opening new warehouses or expanding their network, and coming in on the ground floor and really like building out those facilities and getting processes and hiring and ramping up. And if you go through a new facility startup and you're kind of instrumental in the project, I mean, like, it take a couple months to get going really, but a couple months is like a couple years in experience really in the
Yeah,
warehousing
really.
industry. And I think, I'm very grateful for that, because it got me to see a lot of different sides of the business and get involved with a lot of different like vendors and looking at different things. And instead of just being like, coming into an already like thriving existing facility, being able to really, help build up from the ground up, and make some bad decisions sometimes and learn from that, and also make some good decisions, figure out what works and what doesn't work, and all those kinds of things. So like definitely grateful for that experience.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. And so I want to geek out in a minute on supply chain. I want to get back to the
Sure.
podcast as well, but I want to ask you this question. So as you're doing all this, you've got a son, you've got interests in your community, you teach other things. What are some advice you can give to folks listening? How do you balance this thing? I mean, entrepreneurs don't own a license on being overworked, right? But we all work hard. That's fine. But there's a unique amount of time and focus you spent building your podcast, as well as teaching, raising your son. How does all that play together in your world, and what can you offer folks who are at home kind of looking at their world going, oh my gosh, you got so much going on?
Yeah, man, I think that it it was definitely tough in the beginning. Like over time, I figured out how to better structure my time, better manage my time. But yeah, I mean, when I started the podcast, I mean, I was still, I didn't like quit my job and start the podcast. Like I was still working, as the warehouse manager, and um, it certainly wasn't like a typical 8 hour day, as the warehouse manager and going through projects and things that I was doing,
I was going to say
in
for,
the
for
roles I
folks at
was
home
at.
that don't know about the warehouse, a warehouse manager is literally like when you hear that
Yeah.
phraseology of a one-legged man at a butt kicking contest or a one-arm paper hanger or whatever else, that applies in spades to a warehouse manager. To start your own business while you're still running a warehouse. Woof, that had to be
Yeah. So,
taxing.
yeah. So, it's definitely was longer than 8 hour days sometimes. And there were certainly times too where it was like, cause at one point I was in like a multi shift operation, and, it was kind of like trying to straddle both shifts, or like, go home for a little bit, have dinner, like say goodnight to my son, spend some time with him, and then come back some nights for the third shift to like do some things with them, because we were still getting this facility running. So like there's still processes that need to be trained, or, new hires that are coming in as we try to like bolster up these shifts and things like that. So yeah, so I would say the one, if there was any like secret at that point, was just sleep less, basically.
Be young, sleep less.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, which I wouldn't say necessarily is the best advice, right? But or the healthiest advice maybe at
Yeah.
some point. But I mean, that was the one thing. Like, and I think the thing there that probably would, make that possible for me was that I found like passion in the podcast, right? And, I would say like, yeah, like I enjoy my job, but, did I have like true passion there necessarily? Not necessarily, right? And that was kind of like, passion and creative outlet as well, which I think, made it easier for me to say like, oh, you know what, like, yeah, I'm going to work on this thing until, 1:30 in the morning, and then, wake up in 4 hours and go do a full days of work at the warehouse. Right. And, I think when you find that thing, like you start to, like the sacrifice becomes easier, right? It doesn't necessarily feel like as much of a sacrifice because you're enjoying like what you're sacrificing for. Um, and yeah, it's just kind of finding that balance over time. And then, over time, like I saw that it started to pay dividends, like it was starting to build up. And I think what really was like a catalyst for like the podcast growth, which kind of helped to take me to the next level of thinking about it as a business potentially, was I started in 2019, and then shortly after went to ProMat in 2019, which is one of the biggest, trade show conferences for the warehouse. And I didn't even know what that was when I started the podcast. I like was talking to somebody through the podcast, or that I'd made a connection through when I started this thing, and they're like, "Oh, are you going to be at ProMat?" And I was trying to fit in the industry, so I'm just like, "Oh, I'm thinking about it, whatever." And get off the call, like, Google real
What
quick,
is
like ProMat.
ProMat?
What is ProMat? Yeah, yeah. And I like look at it, and I'm like, and you're familiar with ProMat, so like I was like, oh, like this is where I need to be. Like
Yeah,
this is
totally.
like the everything that is about the warehouse and stuff is there. So I just kind of took like a shot, and sent him an email, asked him like if, because I kind of in my head I'm like, oh, I guess like technically maybe I'm press now. So I asked for like a press pass, and they gave me a press pass. And I'll say like shout out to MHI for sure, because they've kind of embraced me from the beginning, which has been awesome. But by doing that, that got me on all these like press lists. And now all of a sudden, all these companies reaching out to me, like saying like, oh, do you want to come talk to us at ProMat? Do you want to come talk to us here? And I realized like, okay, like this is an opportunity potentially. Um, so it's kind of like these moments where you learn like, okay, like, this is an opportunity. So I got to like try and go as much in on this as possible, even though I'm still working. So like I took vacation days. I like put an ad on Craigslist to get some people to work for me out there, like trying to spread the word at ProMat. And I'm like, I gotta like get as much out of these 3 days as possible. I bought like a little handheld recorder, and I just ran around that place for 3 days straight. I think I did like 41 interviews in 3 days.
Wow.
Just
So you didn't
like,
have a booth. You just walked around and were
no,
talking to folks.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. And I had like, and that was before like I even thought that like, okay, I can schedule these ahead of time, all these things. And like, I was just running around like booth to booth, like, oh, like I have this podcast about warehousing. Would somebody be interested in doing an interview? Like, let's talk about what you have
That's
here in the
brilliant.
booth, right? Or something like that. Um, and some people, were kind of like, no. And, but lots of people, said yes, which I was like very thankful for. And some of them, like I still talk to today. And, um, so yeah, so as it started to grow, then I started to like think about it more consciously from a time perspective. Like, how do I get the most out of this? And and one of the other challenges too was that because I was working and my podcast is all interviews for the most part. I mean, probably like 99% of the 500 episodes have a guest on them. Was that most of the people that I wanted to interview, they wanted to be interviewed during work hours. So, that's like
Yeah.
challenging too. Like I would be maybe done, try and like run home really quick to still be in, or I would try to like get guests that are, I'm in New Jersey. So I try to get guests that are like on the West Coast, right? Because like my 6 o'clock is still like their work
Yeah.
day. And on all these things, like to just try and get it done. But when I started to do like that ProMat situation, then I kind of got in my head like, oh, I could maybe like batch these somehow, right? Where I could take advantage of these opportunities to get a bunch of interviews together. And over time, like I able to kind of structure my time into figuring out how to do that, and then managing it better. And then as it continued to grow, like, now I've been able to like bring in an assistant to help me with scheduling and things like that. And, eventually it grew up to the point where like, I was able to leave like the regular corporate job. And now like this is kind of like the main thing. But even in this time now, like, it is still like working at night sometimes to try and balance that and figure that out. And I would say like from a time perspective, being an entrepreneur, like, is so much more of a benefit. Like you kind of own your time in a much better way. So like, for example, you mentioned my son, like, being an entrepreneur has given me like so much more flexibility to like be around with him and, go to like school things that are going on, and all those different things and be like more a part of those things than, working for somebody else because, you can only like take so much time and, especially like if you're in a warehouse and, you can't just like kind of, it's different than, just working at a desk where it's like, oh, like, the spreadsheet will be here when I come
Get
back.
to it
But it's
later.
like,
Yeah.
there's still 1,000 orders that need to go out today. Like, how are we going to drive that and get that out? Right. So yeah, so it's been learning for sure how to figure that out. And I'm still not the best at time management. I'm still like learning now. I'm trying to figure out, been trying to do like block my schedule more and things like that and get to that, and be more, I guess, disciplined in that sense. But yeah, I think the one big thing that I've kind of, it's been a little bit of like an unlock for me or a key is things that I know that I have to do, repetitively or that I have a lot of, like, for example, like the podcast itself, right? Like I know that, okay, every week I'm releasing a podcast on Monday and Wednesday. So I know that I need podcasts, right? So I've been able to figure out a way to like batch those recordings, right? So, like 1 to 2 days a month. On each day, I'll record 5 to 6 episodes in a day. And now I know, like, okay, I'm good. So, like, everything in between, now I can focus on that. It's not like, okay, I need, now, like, I'm going to record on one on Tuesday. So I know that, like, okay, I need to be here because this is where I record from. And now, okay, I'm going to record another one on Thursday. And then I need to be back here again to focus on that. So that's giving me like more flexibility with time and more flexibility with, where can I be to work and, also to do other things as well. Because if I need to record an episode, like I'm kind of tied to this location here, like for at least like half the day, right? Because I
Yeah.
need to
Right.
be here, I need to set up, and then I need to get ready, and then need to actually record, and then it's kind of like it doesn't make the whole day shot, like it can't be mobile, but in the sense, like I know I need to be tied to this location and close by, and so it's certainly an ongoing learning, and it's I would say in the spirit of the warehouse, it's a continuous improvement effort. Yeah.
There you go. That's right.
Yeah.
You did say in passing, as you're 500 episodes in, and
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you're not. So I've piddled in podcasting about as long as you have just labored, and there's a big difference. And your laboring for 500 episodes is a massive accomplishment. I don't know how many episodes. I don't know how many podcasts have that moniker, but it's very few. I think Asher was talking to me about, and anything over 20 episodes is like in the top 1% of podcasting, which tells you consistency is very difficult in this area. And for you to reach 500, it's just, it's amazing. It's a great feat. And I know you're rocking and ready to get 500 more in the can. I get it. But it's testament to some balance. And I'll tell you, talk about blocking schedules and being deliberate about your time. When I'm at my best, almost always one of the things I'm doing well is blocking my time, and not just blocking out things, but being intentional about my time, to your point, being thoughtful as opposed to, and it's so hard to not get in this way in the world is, chasing tails, chasing, whatever's happening and being reactive. It's just, it's tough. So when I'm at my best, I'm blocking my schedule as well and being deliberate. It really does help.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm trying to get better at that for sure.
Well, yeah, continuous improvement, right? So let's talk
Yeah.
about continuous improvement. Let's get into supply chain. So
Sure.
you've had all these episodes, and the majority of them, vast majority, more than just a few, or only a few have you just been you. Mostly, you've been interviewing professionals within the supply chain arena. I would love to hear some of Kevin Lawton's top takeaways or whatever else from
Yeah.
over these years of interviewing folks, whether it's a strategic or tactical thing or a leadership thing or just technology, anything that you really could see trends. I'd love to kind of dig into that a little bit. And for those who are listening at home, maybe aren't in the supply chain industry, you can always learn anything from another discipline. But we do have folks that listen from the supply chain world, and I think your perspective is unique. I'm not sure there's anybody else right now in supply chain that has your level of perspective because of what you've done these last few years. So I'd love to hear from you. What are some top trends, some things you've seen, interesting stories, whatnot?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it is like you said, I think it's a unique perspective because, um, not that necessarily I've been able to implement and use all of these solutions that have come out, but like I've been able to talk to so many people doing so many different things within the space. And so, it kind of gives me this different perspective and a bunch of knowledge too on what's going on. So yeah, I think what's interesting, I feel like in hindsight, right? If I think about when I started the podcast and when it first came out in 2019, like I feel like that was really almost like a turning point in the industry right around that time. And not because my podcast came out. I mean, that has nothing to do with it. But like from a technology perspective, because like I talked about the ProMat 2019 that I went to, and I went there. There was a couple robotic applications, nothing like really major. And now you look 5 years from now, like I walked into Modex this year, and I mean, it's just like,
It's amazing.
and this is, the feedback from everybody is just like, it's just robots, automation
Robotic show.
everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like a lot of people said that, right? Like, is this actually a robotic show now? And, yeah, I mean, I think that's one for sure. That's like overarching that just stands out, right? It's just the influx of robotics and automation and just the rapid advancement in technology in the last 5 years in our space has been pretty incredible. And I think, I guess along those same lines, like one thing that stands out to me and I think keeps me interested and excited in the industry is that we see all these cutting edge technologies out there. Like we can take the two examples of like humanoids and AI, right? Like those are widely talked about, not just in our industry, every industry pretty much, like in just popular culture in general, and looking at these things. But it's like they're finding actual practical applications and use cases in the warehousing industry. And I think that makes the space super exciting is that, like a company can go out and they can have some like crazy idea and crazy solution that's like revolutionary. But then ultimately like they find a use for it in the warehousing industry, which I think is really cool. It's cool to be a part of the space that's doing that. Um, so that's one thing for sure. And then I think one thing that's interesting is when I first started, there was so much talk about the lights out, dark warehouse, right? Fully automated warehouse. And that was like the big buzz and the big conversation. And you really don't hear that much anymore. It's more about collaborative robotics. It's more about augmenting the human, I think is the way some people are putting it, and enabling the human to do more and be more productive while bringing in robotics and automation. And I think that's really interesting to see, like that twist, because I
Yeah.
think it's the more I've talked to people and the more I've explored some of these solutions and seen how operations are going and evolving. Um, you know, the fully automated dark warehouse becomes like it's almost like, I mean, they're certainly out there, like, and there's
They're
certainly
out
people
there.
that are doing it, right?
Yeah.
But it's becoming like more and more it's almost like mythical, I guess, in a sense, right? I think there's so much variability and variation in an operation that it's very, very hard to have an application where you can like completely remove the human from it. And I think, we see some of that where, it's taken, I think, much longer to like robotic arms that can do piece picking, right? I mean, they're getting there now, right? But they've been around for a little while, and it's been difficult for those companies to really get that grasping technology um, the right way and like the vision technology
Vision.
overall. And now we're seeing rapid advancements in that, but
Yep.
um, Yeah, I think those are probably some of the biggest things, but I think overarching too, it's been really cool to see. You mentioned earlier, like where somebody comes into the space, like they're gonna pull up my podcast, right? And to that, one of the biggest, maybe probably like the top pieces of feedback that I've gotten from people as I've connected with them on LinkedIn or ran into them at conferences and trade shows, and they're like, "Oh, I listened to your podcast," is that they found my podcast because they weren't in the space before. Now they're in the space and they were looking for something to learn from, right? And that's kind of like, I mean, it's almost like my journey, right? And starting the podcast in a
Yeah.
sense, right? Um, so it's very like relatable to me, but I think it's also interesting because it points out that there are a lot of people now shifting careers into supply chain, into warehousing, because we're getting that attention and we're being realized as like a real central part and integral part for overall business and just like consumer delivery as a whole. And I think that's really like very cool and exciting to see too.
For all that the pandemic did that was horrible, one of
Mm,
those things that it did that wasn't so horrible is it absolutely put a spotlight on supply chain.
yeah.
And some of that was in the pains of supply chain, but certainly
Yeah.
I think you're right. There's a lot more interest in how goods are getting moved around the world today than there ever has been in my lifetime, at least in my engagement in the industry. And that has, and then you combine that with the confluence of that plus all this cool technology rolling into it. It's an exciting time in the space, certainly. And you're right out there in front with it. You're talking to all the guys who are way out on the bleeding edge, but also right there in the practical side, delivering value as well. So it's pretty cool, man.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's one of the interesting things. And I interviewed a lot of people during the pandemic too. And I was still working during the pandemic as a plant manager, and we never shut down or anything like that, never worked from home, nothing like that. And so I was kind of seeing all the impacts like firsthand on the labor and just protocols and all these things in the operation. But there was a lot of innovation, I think, that came out of the pandemic to try and navigate around some of these things and try and deal with the spike in overall demand from e-commerce and just all those things in general. So it's pretty kind of incredible how we kind of came out of that, and some of the things that really were developed and just rapidly advanced like through that happening.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Kevin, it's been awesome having you on here. Turning the tables on you a little bit, taking the antagonist microphone and asking you the questions. It's been great to hear your journey, what you've been up against, how you've balanced. I love it. People can find your podcast on any platform that has podcasts, right? The New Warehouse.
Yeah.
If you're interested in what's going on in distribution and supply chain, lots of technology there, lots of process talk. It's good stuff. So if you're into those things, Kevin's podcast is fantastic to listen to. Kevin Lawton, thanks for coming on, and good luck with everything. And I'll be following you. I'll be listening along the way.
All right. Thank you very much, Alex.